Do you recognize one of the grandest ships that ever carried the British flag?
Georgic is the first big ship to be launched from a British shipyard.
She had a wonderful war record, sinking 2 enemy submarines and carrying thousands of troops in safety. They called her the Old Reliable.
In 1881, a new rail line was built for a company called the Canadian Pacific Railway. Being one of the largest rail lines in Canada, it made its owners a killing. This meant that the rail company could build an empire of its own. This would eventually lead to them to charter Cunard's Abyssinia and Parthia to see how profitable entering the ocean liner trade would be. Now, if you couldn't tell, these chartered ships proved successful, leading to the Canadian Pacific Line to build their own ships called the Empress of China, the Empress of Japan, and the Empress of India. Now, while these ships were successful, by the early 20th century they were outdated, leading to the construction of 2 new ships. These ships were to be called the Empress of Austria and the Empress of Germany. The yard number of this new ship was 442. She was to be built by the Fairfield Shipbuilding Company, and during the construction process it was decided that these ships were to be renamed Empress of Ireland and the Empress of Britain. If you couldn't tell, today we're covering the Empress of Britain. Design-wise, these 2 sister ships were to look identical to each other. In fact, look so identical that while making a video on the Empress of Ireland, I used the wrong ship in the thumbnail. Whoops. She was to be powered by 2 quadruple expansion steam engines, giving her a service speed of 18 knots. Her interiors were stunning for the time and her route. She was launched on the 11th of November 1905, and by the 5th of May 1906, she was ready for her maiden voyage. The Empress of Britain left on her maiden voyage on May the 5th, 1906. This would begin her amazing career, as on her second voyage she'd break the record for the fastest westbound crossing on her route. 6 years later, in April of 1912, a ship would collide with an iceberg. Of course I'm referring to the Empress of Britain, as it's not like any other ship hit an iceberg that month of that year. I mean, could you imagine if one did and it sunk too? Anyway, back to the subject, as a few months after her attempt to reenact the Titanic, she thought she'd reenact the Olympic and collided with a collier called the Helvetia in the St. Lawrence River, which was eerily similar to what would happen to the Empress of Britain's sister ship, the Empress of Ireland, 2 years later in 1914. But unfortunately, the Empress wouldn't have much time to grieve the loss of her sister ship before she was dragged into danger. Europe in 1914. Filled with tons of empires and tons of advanced weapons. What could go wrong? Oh God! In 1914, an Austrian was shot by a Serbian in Bosnia. This led to the First World War. Now, this meant that the British needed ships, and this would lead to the Empress of Britain being requisitioned by the British government and being converted into a troop ship. In this role, she would sail to places like Cape Verde, Egypt, and the Dardanelles. While she was moving troops across the world, she would have a few incidents. One was on the 12th of December 1915, when she collided with a Greek steamer, sinking her. Then, on the 13th of December, she would collide with a French troop ship, killing 2 stokers. After these incidents, she would go on to serve as a troop ship until the end of the war. After the First World War, the Empress of Britain would be involved in the repatriation of Canadian troops, after which she'd be handed back to the Canadian Pacific Line. Upon her return to her owners, she'd be sent off to Clydebank to have her coal-burning engines replaced by oil-burning engines, as they were more efficient. She'd go on to serve her owners without event until 1924, when she was sent for a refit that made it so she could carry 600 cabin-class passengers and 800 third-class passengers. This refit also saw the Empress of Britain's name being changed to Montreal. She'd go on to serve the Canadian Pacific Line without event throughout the Roaring Twenties, but unfortunately she wouldn't survive much longer beyond that, as thanks to competition on the route she served on, she'd become quite dated. and this meant after 25 years she'd be pulled from service and then sent off to Stavanger Shipbreaking Company to be broken up in Norway, finally bringing an end to the Canadian Pacific's Old Reliable. While the Empress herself no longer exists, some elements of her live on, as her woodwork was saved and is now used as a Montreal lounge in a hotel. It even has some windows from the ship, which is amazing, as in a way, it is not only the last living, breathing things left from the Empress of Britain, but also one of the last living, breathing things left the Empress of Ireland. Well, that isn't on the bottom of the St. Lawrence River, that is.